And before I present the three presenters for this panel, I just want to mention I'm going to be timing your presentations. I have a stopwatch next to me. When you reach the 15-minute mark, I will tell you so. You're welcome to continue, but obviously, because you have each about 20 minutes, but if you continue beyond the 15 minutes, then of course there will be less question time, or perhaps no question time for your presentation. So just be aware of that. I also just wanted to say before I present the speakers, I have just posted in the chat now the link to the current call for papers for the journal that is associated with this conference. So if you haven't checked it out already, please do so. The deadline for submissions is the 5th of August, so you still have a bit of time. And with that, I'm going to now introduce the speakers for this panel. And the first speaker out is Mattia Boscaino from University of Birmingham. He will be followed by Gabriela Leal from Universidade Nova de Lisboa. And then finally, Lachlan MacDowall from the Meerkat Institute in Melbourne. Mattia will be presenting a paper called Developing a Qualitative Approach to the Study of the Street Art World. And I give the word to you, Mattia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So we'll just start with the screen sharing just quick as possible so that we can that. Okay, so morning everyone. My name is Mattia and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Birmingham. Today I'm going to be talking about how I approached the street art world in my PhD study. Okay, in this presentation I will talk about the methodology that I used to conduct my doctoral study on street art. The focus is on the method, but of course I wanted to briefly refer to the approach towards the street art world, as well as the philosophical assumptions behind the study conducted. This is because the study used an inductive reasoning and was inspired by the Gioia et al. 2012 methodology for the study of social words, which requires the researcher to articulate a phenomenon and explore the extant literature in order to identify the theoretical gaps and then assess them inductively. In my PhD study, I looked at different aspects of street art. For example, it becoming a popular global and local phenomenon during the late 1990s and early 2000s. The fact that it rose to popularity thanks to the representation of artistic graffiti through published media during the 80s and 90s, as well as the intertwinement and connections with other forms of creativity, such as hip-hop music. The fact that today street art has evolved compared to how it first appeared in the streets in the early 2000s and uses digital platforms that allow artworks to be available on everybody's screens and experienced on blogs, social media, webzines, and the lots. But therefore, there is this whole new phenomenon which is characterized by both analog and digital aspects, where street art is seen, experienced, and discussed. And we have the participation of different actors that contribute to the value of street artworks. Therefore, in this context, it is not completely clear how street artworks become renowned and celebrated as such, and which actors intervene in this process, although there is a relevant learning that I did from the literature. In particular, the purpose of the study became to understand how in the digital era, known street artworks become renowned, and whatever happens in this transformation process that we can see here, which in my PhD study, I refer to as the black box. So this is the focus of my PhD study. Therefore, following the Gioia methodology, which requires the articulation of a phenomenon before collecting the data, the investigation started by exploring the extant relevant literature, which allowed the development of an analytical framework which guided the whole study. The framework was developed into two literature pillars, metaphorically sustaining the whole framework, because of the multidisciplinary perspectives involved when one considers street art. One pillar is on the history, on the practice, and on the actors involved in street art. And the other one is on the models that explain how different actors can come together and co-create the value of a commodity together with forms of interactive art valuation. So these analytical frameworks served to provide an initial explanation to who are the actors involved in the phenomenon of street art today, the digital era, as well as giving an initial understanding of how different people can collaborate and create value in the media, for example. However, during this literature review, some theoretical gaps were identified and then informed the evolution of the study. So, of course, as we can see here, the different questions that I had during the literature review, they were further developed into the research questions of the study. So we get these 3 research questions in the pillar 1, and 2 more research questions which are more related to co-creation, art valuation, and the value chain in pillar 2. So these are the 5 research questions that were used to develop and to conduct the study. After identifying the theoretical gaps in the literature, the study aimed at addressing this gap with a methodology, starting by taking philosophical positions in relation to the street art world. To do that, I would like to remember that the aim of my study was to include as many subjectivities, so to be able to generate a theory that explains how street art works in the digital era become renowned. So the philosophical positions are: street art is a socially constructed phenomenon. Its meaning and place in society depend on the attitudes and on the experiences of the actors involved in it. So we're looking at social constructionism. Then we also know that the meaning of street art depends on the experiences of the different subjects that are involved in it. So the different actors. So we're looking at subjectivism. Moreover, the study aims at descending street art from the experiences and perspectives of the people involved in it. But therefore, the theory that is going to be generated, that was generated in this study, was coming from analyzing the data. So it's a data-driven study and is aiming at theory building. So we can summarize these positions by saying that I adopted an interpretive philosophical paradigm, and that the study was used an inductive reasoning. So it was data-driven and it was focused on theory building. Then also wanted to situate the study, and of course I wanted to look at street art in the UK, mainly in the UK, because the UK was is considered to be one of the birthplaces in the world of what we know today as street art. So by considering all these positions, the study was designed as a qualitative multi-method study, which allowed the consideration of different perspectives, as well as both analog and digital accounts of realities in the study. Both accounts of some of the actors that are part of street art, as well as looking at what happens online, specifically on social media. And for this reason, one of the methods that was adopted was what Kozinets refers to as observational ethnography or passive ethnography. Okay, so which methods did I use? First of all, conducted semi-structured interviews with 3 types of participants, so street artists, street art curators, and street art connoisseurs. I used a heterogeneous purposive sampling for the 3 groups. So conducted 15 interviews with street artists, 15 interviews with raters and 15 with the connoisseurs. Then I used what I called conversations on social networking sites. The social networking sites are a term used by COSINETs in ethnography, refer to the digital sites where interaction among users happens. For this data type, I collected 6 conversations and the sampling was purposive again, following the 7 characteristics identified by COSINETs in the data collection of online content. And finally, I generated a total of 50 field notes in order to bring also my own perspective as a researcher, and also to keep track of the evolution of the study, and also keep track of first impressions, the first patterns that seemed to emerge from collecting the data and from analyzing the data. So this was the multi-method, and I wanted to include all these 3 methods because I wanted to be able to have a triangulated set of findings that consider different perspectives. So how did I go through them? As I was saying, I conducted interviews, I collected conversations on social networking sites, and I generated field notes. Now, in the data collection phase of the study, the field notes were more observational. I wanted to keep track of how people reacted to my questions about street art, how people were behaving, and how respondents were behaving on social media. For example, I was introducing myself. And so when the data collection was completed, I wanted to keep doing like the generation of field notes, because that is one of the main aspects that starts the actual analysis in grounded theory models in qualitative studies. And when that was completed, I started to transcribe and collate the data in order to make them in a suitable format for analysis. Now, that is quite easy for interviews and for field notes because they are already, I mean, you just have to transcribe them, of course. It's a bit more complicated for the conversations on social networking sites because they are a bit more than just textual information. So I had to perform an initial analysis of this social media data to identify the patterns. And this initial analysis was informed by the observational field notes. And this consisted of separating the 4 main components of the social media data. So we had the visual part, the comments, the caption, and the reactions, and I was selecting small portions of the visual and the textual part and assigning them labels and tags if you want. And then once that was done, I was able to perform the open coding and reflection of all the related data that I had using the Joya et al. and the COSINET approach. While I was doing the open coding, I was also generating further field notes. In this case, they are not observational like the ones that I used before. They were more reflective field notes, according to Joya and Saunders. They are also referred to as memoing, so to keep track of how the patterns emerge from the data. And once that was done, I was able to perform a full-blown thematic analysis using the Joya et al. Methodology, which works with first order and first order analysis by being informant-centric and second order analysis by being more theory-centric, creates these themes. Now, all the themes that I created, they were grouped and abstracted from them, to identify the 4 aggregate dimensions of the phenomenon. So these are the social process, where we have different actors that are involved. They interact with one another in order to establish, build, and adjust their relationship and influence the value of street art. These little squares we see on the left are the themes of each dimension. We have the value co-creation dimension. So there are homogeneous groups of actors that influence the value of street art works according to their interests, their work, their actions. We have the creative practice dimension, for which it was clear that street artists, they tend to shape their creative practice according to what they want to achieve. So we can have street art for art's sake and street art for other purposes, like business purposes. And we have the community dimension, which the behavior of street artists within their groups of peers seem that of a community of practice where there is a continuous informal learning, sharing of resources, skills, business opportunities. But we also have a further, like a fifth dimension, which is the value elements, which has not been discussed in my PhD thesis separately, but it has been articulated within the other dimensions. Okay, so this is basically my methodological approach to the study of street art. And just because I have 20 seconds more, I just wanted to summarize it like step by step, so that we have a clearer picture. So the study starts by identifying the problem, and in my case it was the black box, and articulating a phenomenon of interest. Then the next step is to review literature, so to find theoretical gaps, taking philosophical and situating positions, designing the study, that it in my multi-method, collecting the data and generating observational field notes, analyzing the data and generating reflective field notes, and reporting results or findings. And in my thesis, also discussed the findings against the literature. So that was all from my side, and I hope I didn't go much beyond the assigned time. Yeah,
it's perfect. It's a pleasure when people time themselves as well. Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes for questions. If anyone wants to say something. I can only see some of you, so I can't necessarily see if you raise your hand. So maybe just speak up if you want to say something. Otherwise, I can start off with a question. So I can't help but notice, of course, and those who know me will not be surprised by this.
One from Negar.
Okay, go ahead, Negar. Negar, did you want to talk?
You are muted somehow. No, we can't hear you. We can see your face.
I will ask a question in the meantime, and hopefully we can sort out the sound problem. So for those who know me and know my research, there is a connection between what you have done and what I have done in my research, and that is related to the term the street art world. And I'm wondering, how did you conceptualize that? Did you go into philosophy with Arthur Danto, for instance, or was it drawing on Howard Becker in terms of the concept of the art world, or how did you approach the concept of the art world?
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, okay. I approached the art world by exploring the extant literature that was able to explain how street art is experienced now society as like differently from what it was like 20 years ago when it first started to go into the mainstream media. So there were different papers and studies that contributed to making of my conceptual framework. They were specifically related to the consumption of media online, on social media, for example. And that was also the reason why I did not just focus on like street art in particular, but the framework was extended in the sense of co-creating the value, like models of digital value co-creation, which I was also experienced because of my previous work in media crowdsourcing in media agencies. But yeah, I mean that is basically the conceptual basis of approach street art.
Did you come in? During your literature search, did you find anyone who had been writing about the street art world previously?
About the street art world, yes. I mean there are different papers. I have a long list of of literature sources that I considered. Quite recent. They are quite recent publications. Many of them are also related to the Street Art and Urban Creativity Journal, the different editions in the past 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
No, I ask because I published a book called The Street Art World in 2014.
Yeah.
And also Alison Young, I think in 2016, published a book called Street Art World. But I think we conceptualize the street art world a bit differently. So I was just wondering if you had conceptualized it in a third way, or whether you had looked at the previous literature specifically on that. Anyway, okay. Maybe we should see if Negard is able to, or if anyone else wants to say something. Negard?
I don't know if you can.
Okay. Yes, we can hear you now.
So I was wondering, you talked about for researching that part about social process, and you mentioned the social media influence on how people evaluate maybe the street art. I was wondering what you think, how you think it can relate to spatiality of street art, because when you research them through their, I mean, when you research the reproductions on social media, do you still call them street art? Because part of the street art is the identity is related to spatiality and how people relate to it through their spatial relations.
Absolutely, yes. It's a very good question. Identity and the value of the, you say, reproductions of street art on the internet, on social media, on blogs, be referred to as metadata of metadata, because you actually have like reproduction of, like you have the first appearance of a street artwork on a wall, then you have somebody that takes a photograph of it, so it's really like taking it outside of its context and then putting that on a social media platform. So we have a sort of multiplication of the reproductions of street art. So in this process, it's evident that the value, the meaning of street artworks is changing, is evolving. In my PhD, I wanted to include as many subjectivities and as many perspectives, as well as the observation of how the reproductions of street art on digital platforms affect perceived value of street artworks by their authors and in the community. So it's like a big understanding of the value.
We're gonna have to cut it there. We're over time. So, but again, you can continue the discussion in the chat if you wish. Right now, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Gabriela Leal from Universidad Nova de Lisboa, and she's going to be talking about street epistemologies. Gabriela, the floor is yours.
Hi all. I'm going to share my screen. Wait a minute. Do you see in the presentation mode?
Yes.
Right? Okay. I'm gonna start my stopwatch to track properly my time also. And starting now. Hi, hello everyone. Thanks for being here today, and special thanks to Pedro and other members of the scientific committee for having me on the panel. My name is Gabriela Leal. I'm an urban anthropologist from the Global South, more specifically from São Paulo, Brazil, but currently I'm living in Lisbon, where I'm doing my PhD in urban studies. Well, I've been studying São Paulo's graffiti scene since my master research at the University of São Paulo, which means since 2016. And after I also approached Pichação through other research projects as Transurb Arts, coordinated by Ricardo Campos, a researcher here from Portugal. The following reflections synthesize some learnings from research based on ethnographies and in-depth interviews. So it is from the point of view of the anthropology that I'm talking here. And the title of my communication is Street Epistemologies, Reflections on Urban Knowledge Produced in São Paulo's Graffiti and Pichação. And as you can see, my lack of ability in creating short titles has a positive side. So the title already presented the theme of my communication. I'm going to try, as everyone here, to tell a very short story about a very complex issue. So wish me luck. And hey ho, let's go. Here, and it didn't pass it. Oh, okay. As many of you know, and it's related with some discussion we are having before here. There is a complex lexicon that nominates different visual urban interventions like street art, urban art, graffiti, and the list go on. Sometimes, indeed, the same term refers to different contents, indicating different representations, structures in operation. In other words, not always the term is self-explained as it seems to be. In the context of São Paulo, it gets more complicated as other terms with the same sound but different orthographies are used to refer in some ways to pichação and graffiti, like these pairs here. I'm gonna read in Portuguese so you can understand what I'm talking about. Pichação, pichação, graffiti, graffiti. So they sound the same, but they are not talking about the same things. And so let me start situation from which perspective and structure of representation I'm referring to graffiti and pichação. And full disclosure here, I'm in the first column, and the police and the legal justice and media are in the second column. So here I'm using these terms from the perspective of the protagonist of this practice, which means that I use the terms the way they write, but also I'm understanding these practices as they understand it, as a way of existing in the world and something that is far beyond the walls. So as not everybody here necessarily is familiar with pichação, let me present a short overview. Pichação appeared in São Paulo in the 80s, but a few years later, it spread to other cities in Brazil and more recently worldwide. As you can see here in Lisbon, you can see some pichação from pichadores from São Paulo that came to here and are living here. The inscriptions are called picho and are characterized by straight, long, angular, and monochromatic lines, an aesthetic elaborated in dialogue with CD covers of punk and heavy metal bands, also from the 80s. Each picho is personalized by each pichador or group of pichadores to create their own identity and stand out on the city surfaces. As you can see, there's some differences in the photo between the different pictures in the building facade. So understanding this typography requires an initiation that allows its reading and enables the apprehension of elements that reveal a sphere of competitions, alliances, challenges, and conquest of status. Another aspect that characterizes pichação is the surfaces chosen for painting, generally, but not only, located on the facades and tops of the buildings, which requires specific body techniques to invade buildings and perform climbings without equipment. It's something crazy, and you can easily find some videos in the YouTube with pichadores climbing some buildings without equipment to paint. And the selection of the location dialogues with the achievements of status, since whoever paints higher and in place with difficult access wins greater respect and admiration among their peers. So in the pichação scene, those who are not seen are not remembered, as they say. So there are evident efforts from pichadores to face the inscriptions in permanence in their urban spaces, resulting in the production of some artifacts. The composition of albums that bring together photographs and clippings from magazines and newspapers is a widespread practice. And another very common practice is the collection of folhinhas. And as you can see, these sheets of papers where pichadores write their picho and exchange it with each other. They collected it also. And the folhinhas are fundamental for getting to know and making themselves known, as well as to preserve the memory of pichação, ensuring the permanence of inscriptions over time. It also an important tool to learn how to read the pichos in the surface of the city. Well, graffiti and pichação are different practices with their own aesthetic, political, moral, and bodily dimensions. However, it is possible to establish some approximation between them, especially in São Paulo, the cradle of pichação, and where these practices coexist intensely. As you can see in the photo, we can see some tags, some throw-ups, and in the middle, some pichos. And it's a very common scene to see in the city. And both practices emerged in the 80s, and their protagonists are mostly residents of periphery areas. This means that in both cases, painting implies moving extensively and intensely throughout the urban fabric. Pichadores and writers have friendship ties and share common nodes in their sociability networks. Many of them are neighbors, live in the same neighborhood, study at the same school, so they are related, most of them. Moreover, there are recurrent cases of writers who started in pichação and then went on to graffiti, or subjects who move between both, doing pichação and also graffiti, depending on the time and on their circumstances. Therefore, it's not by chance that in addition to sharing and disputing the city surfaces, so there is conflict between them, pichadores and writers exchange also knowledge, have alliances, and share ethics that guarantee their coexistence in the city. Through graffiti and pichação, writers and pichadores develop skills, produce knowledge, elaborate their subjectivities and ways of being in the world, or more specifically, ways of being in the city. And above all, through these practices, they grow very particular ways of reading and using the urban spaces. When circulating through the city, they are always looking for surface to be painted, constantly mapping the disposable possibilities. This reading orients their eyes into different directions, in the case of pichadores, to the top of the buildings. Through this reading, they also perceive the rhythms that surround each spot they found to be painted. And depending on the rhythm, they can evaluate the probability of police repression or anonymous report. So this specific sensitive reading of the city is very important also. Both practices have initiations that allow to read and identify the content of the inscriptions on the city walls. And as a result, reading inscriptions is also reading stories, memories, presences, and absences. Many times during my research, I heard stories told from the walls, like, oh, that time when we penned there, something happened, or oh, this speech or this graffiti is from someone that already died, and this is from honor him, and the story goes on, and something like that. And when reading the walls, they insert captions and make multiple fragments of the urban fabric familiar. The stories told from the walls line up vestiges of lived cities and create totalities where only they know how to navigate through. And these ways of reading the city are both a condition and a consequence of graffiti and pichação. In this practice, and I'm going to stop before, let me talk about the photos in the left. There's a photo of some pichadores doing the pichação. As you can see, they are not using some equipments to climb. And this one is an Eddie, a woman, very known in the pichação scene in Brazil, in São Paulo. And the other is one of my interlocutor in the center of São Paulo doing some graffiti. Well, so in this practice, the transformations of spaces are not limited to make inscriptions. Through multiple ways of doing, pichadores and writers, while suspending the original functions of surfaces, add new representations and meanings to them, producing other specialities and temporalities. During the painting process, they identify the normative gaps they can play with and create escaped routes in the urban spaces. What does private property really mean? Sometimes I ask myself this question during the painting process, and it's a very nice one because sometimes we normalize as property rights are something natural, and they are definitely not. So they stimulate that some thinking about these norms in the urban spaces. So through different arrangements of tactical actions, writers and pichadores transform time into a resource and symbolically and aesthetically modify the surfaces without permanently taking possession of them. These ways of manipulating and transforming spaces into something else reveal a set of ways of using the city that insinuate themselves in a microbial and plural way throughout the urban spaces. And like the ways of reading, are simultaneously a condition and consequences of these practices. So I'm going to the conclusions. And this way of reading and using urban space produce very specific knowledge about the city, developed and accumulated over time by writers and pichadores. Through particular ways of thinking, they create alternative cartographies that overlap the material and geographic space. These imaginary maps with ethical, epistemological, political, aesthetic, and sensitive layers guide paths, record memories, tell stories, and create relationship. Therefore, it is possible to identify a particular way of organizing what is perceived in the city. In other words, it is possible to identify a specific regime of knowledge about the city produced by pichadores and writers. This knowledge forged in the street results from particular epistemologies. Maybe we can call it street epistemologies. They are produced from painting experiences and they are transmitted in their narratives and sociabilities moments, like this one that I photographed during a graffiti encounter. It is a silent production that provokes other journeys in the constituted order. And its structuring power is as real for them as those of the institutional norm inscribed in the urban spaces. So that's it. Thank you.
Excellent. You are under 15 minutes. So that's very good. I would like to invite questions now from the audience. You can raise your hand. I've figured out that if I open the participants list, I can see who raises their hand.
I was looking for the hand raising button.
Yeah, well, you go ahead, Anna, and then we'll
Sorry.
Yeah.
Olá, Gabriela. I just have a very simple question. When you speak about pichadores and graffiti writers, and they can be the same person or not, it looks from what I know about Pichu, that Pichu is more vertical. It works more in height. So it looks like pichadores look more for high buildings or high places to do their work. And graffiti writers, it's not necessarily like that. And from the pictures I see of cities like São Paulo, it's very rare to see graffiti in a very high place. Do they have a different way of going around? Do you notice this difference between graffiti and Pichu, where Pichu is more about climbing and going to high places, and graffiti not as much? And do they have that special, is this difference something that is related to any other factor, or is it just because it's like that and it's just a coincidence?
To reinforce what I say in the beginning when I was presenting Pichu, they are very different practices, which I mean with some subjects, and it's very recurrent, but not all, is not all the case. Some subjects do both, but it's not, it doesn't mean that the graffiti and pichação are the same. Not at all. Don't get me wrong about this. So there's a lot of differences, and pichação requires a more planning to painting, because they need to literally invade the building. And sometimes they use some strategies like delivery something and broke the building and go to the top, or they climb through the windows from outside. And not all pichadores do that. Some of them do the climbing through the windows, and others invade the building, go to the top, and with some ropes they go down to paint. There's different ways of painting, and it's a total difference, different practice. But one thing that is very interesting between them and the relationship between these subjects, they are friends sometimes, and they are sometimes friends from the schools. So sometimes graffiti writers reach out some pichadores to learn some techniques of climbing, some techniques to painting with some artifacts that pichadores create to paint in buildings, in facades. So I don't know if I answered, but it's something like that.
So it's more physical and more about the adventure and not just about the visual expression. It seems to me to be like that.
It's both, because the adventure is part of pichação,
yeah,
but they are communication between themselves when they are making the pichu. It's about message, it's about challenge, and it's about competition among them. So it's not only about the adventure, it's about also to be seen by the other pichadores.
All right, we'll move on to Malcolm. You have a question.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting presentation. So I saw this interesting photo you had on many drawings, and I wonder if they use the drawings memory, you say, and I wonder if they also use photographies like internally to do these kind of memories, and if there are some recurring practices.
Yes, a lot of photos and also videos. One of the most known pichadores of São Paulo, that is Cripta de Jean, is a video maker also, independent video maker. So he used it to do a lot of videos, like documentaries, recording all the process of pichação in some buildings, and it's very interesting. They are very they collect a lot of memories, and recently we have some exhibitions in São Paulo made by pichadores, and most of them were focused on memories of the pichação and to talk and about this history of pichação. It's very interesting. They are more preoccupied with that than the graffiti writers that I know, actually.
All right, we're over time. Isabel, do you have a short question, or is it, if it's a longer one, can you ask it in the chat? All right, ask it in the chat then. Then we'll move on to Lachlan MacDowall, as I mentioned, from the Meerkat Institute in Melbourne, with his paper Flash Forward: A Series of Art Commissions and Laneways in Melbourne. Lachlan.
Okay, how's that? Can you see my slides?
No, we're not seeing your slides, but we can hear you.
Well, that's no good. Okay, just one moment.
Just to add that Lachlan is making the call from Australia. Yeah, the biggest prison in South Hemisphere at this moment.
All right, I'm just going to try one more thing to configure my computer, and then otherwise I will just speak. Just a second. Okay, here we go. Okay.
Now you're on.
Thanks, everyone. Sorry for the delay, and good to be with you from the other side of the world. It's nighttime, it's winter, everything is upside down. And I'm just going to talk today about another aspect of life here in Melbourne that has turned upside down. So just a little introduction. I am an academic here in Melbourne, and I'm continuing my academic work on graffiti and street art. But more recently, I'm doing more creative kind of practices. And for the last year, I've been working on curating a very large project called Flash Forward. So today I'm going to talk about some of the origins and the curatorial ideas behind this project. I'm not going to show any work from this project. It's ongoing and things are emerging. But I really just wanted to talk about a few ideas that I have used to frame and motivate this project. So here in Melbourne, as Pedro mentioned, we are a giant prison. We have had an unusual journey with COVID in that we have had very few cases of community transmission, and we've had a strategy of elimination, which has resulted in 4 lengthy lockdowns, one lasting more than 3 months, where the population stayed indoors and in our homes. And this has had a dramatic effect on the city. And when this took place, I had been doing some work with the City of Melbourne, and a variety of things happened all at once that put me in a position of being able to propose a large intervention into the city. And this came about because we were able to attract very large amount of government funding. The total is a little bit ambiguous, but perhaps in excess of 6 million euros of funding for this project. And this reflects the fact that Melbourne was really in panic about becoming an empty city and a city full of unemployed people, particularly creatives. So in order to try and grapple with the effects of COVID, to employ artists and also to bring people back to the center of the city, we proposed a project to activate the city's laneways. And many of you may be aware, like many other cities in which you live, Melbourne is well known for street art and graffiti cultures. And the city itself has many laneways. This is the main aspect of Melbourne's kind of branding. So yeah, I was given this opportunity to curate a project around laneways and street art. Now, when other people in Melbourne talk about laneways and street art, they have perhaps a slightly different idea for myself. The idea has street art become very commercial, very mainstream. And the laneways, as I said, have become a branding element of the city. So my attempt was to create a much more critical idea for this project, and thinking about the ideas, particularly, I know Javier's just joined us, but so of Javier's thinking, and also the work of some of the more critical aspects of street art that we've seen and had presented in Lisbon, and also our friends from New Art. These were very influential in proposing this project, Flash Forward. So this is a crazy project. We have 40 laneways in the city, and we are commissioning 40 artworks for the 40 laneways. We also commissioned 40 bands, and each of the band will make a new album of music. So we'll have 40 artists, 40 laneways, 40 bands. We release all of the albums on vinyl, and we have a range of other activities. So there's about 150 people working on the project, and there's about 450 artists working on the project. So in order for this to happen, it has to have some pretty solid and kind of interesting curatorial ideas. So I'm not going to share the work. You can see that unfold from your desktops in the coming months. But I just want to share a couple of the curatorial ideas that were behind the project. And here's the list of all of the crazy people that we commissioned to be involved. So these are the conditions, as I said, of a city in lockdown, a lot of people working from home, a lot of economic disruption, and some very negative government interventions at a national level, but a very active state government who was willing to spend an unprecedented amount of money on street art and graffiti and other things. So these are the 3 curatorial kind of moments or ideas that I wanted to mention that motivated the project. So I'll just talk about each in turn, but particularly focus on the first one, which is this notion that Melbourne is a city based on the imposition of a grid in colonial times. And that it's out of this grid that we have these smaller streets, the laneways. So Melbourne, the place where I live, the city that I'm on, is also a completely different country and context that existed before European settlement. This is the map of the language groups of the indigenous tribes that continue to be the custodians of this land. The occupation here by Indigenous people dates back to at least 40,000 years. And there's been recent, slightly mysterious, contested archaeological dating of a fire pit down the coast from Melbourne that dates back around 200,000 years. So this is a very ancient place, and the arrival, the colonization and the destruction from a European settlement is very recent. So this is something that's very much in the minds of Australians at the moment as we grapple with this kind of impacts of colonization and try and rethink the notion of the city as being both a European construct, but existing on Indigenous land. So the inclusion of Indigenous and First Nations artists and their perspectives in the project's been a really important kind of element. But from the early 19th century, land speculators arrive in this territory, and they are Australian born, but the territory is under the control of the British government. And in the late 1830s, we see the beginnings of Melbourne, and a swampland and a billabong on a river is laid down with a grid kind of system. So this is the famous grid of the city. It's the same grid that is in Manhattan. It's the same grid that's in many European cities. And you can see these major white lines here represent the major streets of Melbourne. It's often talked about as a civic, with civic pride, that this is an easy city to navigate. But you can see also in this grid, apart from the colonial lines of the white lines, there's much more informal, messy kind of laneways. So the first move from a curatorial point of view is to create a little bit of space between the colonial grid and the smaller, more informal and more oddly shaped laneways of the city. Because these laneways, as in other cities, are really about what's repressed in our culture. They're service laneways for the delivery of commodities that are then sold out at the front of the shop. They're a service entrance for laborers, where labor is repressed. Also the repression of bodily activities, bodily waste, toilets, sex, all the kind of things in culture that are repressed are connected to the laneways. This is the surveyor, Robert Hoddle, who laid down the grid in 1837. And as I thought more about this colonial history, I was also struck by a very weird historical coincidence that Robert Hoddle himself was born in London in the 1790s, around the same time as Charles Babbage. And in the year that Hoddle lays down the grid is also the same year that Babbage and Ada Lovelace developed the first computing system. So there's this historical moment in the 19th century that sees Melbourne at the colonial logic of the grid is matched by the kind of technocratic logic of the early digital culture. So I wanted to think about these laneways, thinking back in their history, and think about now how they are still reminiscent of this grid of colonial logic, and also the beginnings of the digital logic, the digital city that's now become pervasive, particularly after COVID, that gives us this kind of shape. So this is the logo of the project, which has begins with a black square, and the black square has in it a number of small laneways that don't go anywhere. They're little cul-de-sac, and the object of the project is to slice into the black kind of square and carve off these small spaces that would mean that we are encouraging people to try and travel through the city in a different kind of way. The architect Le Corbusier says that anyone who travels along a straight line in the city knows exactly where they want to go. And we are encouraging people to move through the city in a way that is not just about shopping or not just about traveling at the highest possible speed, but in taking these little détournements down the laneways and having a different kind of experience of the city that isn't structured by commodity relations or structured by a sense of private ownership of the city. And you can see here a rapper from Melbourne describes the long-term effect that living in a grid city can have. He talks about rap music in the other large Australian city in Sydney, that the Sydney sound is one thing, but Melbourne has a particular sound that's built around the way that the city is organized around the grid. And it finishes with this statement, it's like it's like a grid and there's nowhere to hide. So the grid, rather than being a civic kind of positive feature, is seen also as a trap, as a very rational, confining kind of logic. So the grid was an important kind of feature to rethink the laneways and think them against the colonial and kind of corporate logic. But I was also really moved to think about the connection between laneways and arcades, and the amazing work of Walter Benjamin in his arcades project. It's often thought about as one of the most significant philosophical works of the 20th century. And this is Benjamin's study of the arcades in Paris in the 1870s. And arcades are kind of like covered in laneways, but where it becomes most interesting in Benjamin's work is the attention to detail and the kind of historical delirium that's made possible by his very unusual methodology of carving up small details of everyday life in the laneways and thinking about the city in a different kind of way. And of course, Benjamin, this is we have an example of the Parisian arcades here in Melbourne. So this is a kind of touchstone for the project. But Benjamin sadly dies. He commits suicide in 1941 in the middle of World War II. And the story is quite tragic. He is carrying the manuscript of the arcades project in a suitcase. He's trying to leave France and smuggle himself into Spain to escape the Nazis. And he believes that's not possible, so he commits suicide. But the arcades project lives on, and I think Benjamin's death at the hands of the Nazis, or in fleeing the Nazis, I think is also a really interesting way to rethink the possibilities of these concrete laneways having a kind of anti-fascist impulse when they're read through the arcades project. And his work is anti-fascist in that it's explicitly political about the making of art, but it's also anti-fascist in that it is not spectacular. It's very much about looking under the skin of the city, looking into the small details of the streets and the cities. So Benjamin's methodology, looking at very small details, has been crucial in this project, where we've often looked at very small details in the laneways in order to connect artists to certain spaces, or to musicians to artists, or musicians to certain spaces. So this becomes another kind of key touchstone. So we have laneways as being anti-colonial, laneways as being anti-corporate, and laneways as offering a real material for an anti-fascist kind of project, all of which are very relevant for our contemporary kind of life. And the last thing I want to mention is the third kind of curatorial touchstone, which I think resonates a lot for people in Melbourne and certainly makes it easier for me to explain the project, is to think about what happens when we think about not just Melbourne, but I often use the example of another city that's undergoing major depression, that's full of empty shops, that's also about to experience a pandemic of the HIV crisis. And this is the context of New York in the late 1970s, early 1980s, a period when the city is nearly bankrupt, a period just before HIV/AIDS erupts into the communities there. And this context of a kind of decaying city is also a context, as we know, mythologically, for an amazing burst of creativity.
Coming up in 15 minutes, Lachlan.
No worries. This moment when graffiti writers and street artists, when gay artists and straight artists, black and white, Puerto Rican artists exist in this kind of melting pot of work, is emblematized by this example of the Times Square show, which I know many of you will be familiar with. It's a massage parlor in Times Square that's taken over by a group of artists for a 3-day show. Basquiat and Herring exhibit their first works here. So this is at the heart of the thinking about the project, is this psychic memory that exists for Melburnians of an empty and derelict kind of inner city, which certainly was the case in the 1950s. Is a famous Melbourne painting of people leaving the city to go home to the suburbs at 5 o'clock. But I think that psychic memory of an empty inner city is also a psychic, unsettled memory of the greed and land speculation that gave birth to the European city, and of course the colonial violence that's still kind of repressed. So this is the kind of broad curatorial premise of rethinking these kind of laneway spaces and thinking about how we can use this idea of getting off the grid, that there's an opportunity here to use and commission artists, art and music, street art and other things to rethink the place of the city. So maybe I'll finish there.
All right, very good. In that case, I will open up for questions. Raise your hand in the participants list if you want to ask a question. If not, I have a question for you, Lachlan.
So Peter, you've been to Melbourne. You know it's not an empty city anymore, or it wasn't when you were here. So yeah. Do you have that? Do you have your visit to Melbourne in mind as you ask this question?
I do actually, because what I noticed, and I don't know if this is representative of your entire project, because the scope of it is obviously huge. But I noticed that the grid that you showed early on in the presentation around William Street, Lonsdale Street, I noticed that is very much in central Melbourne. Rather than in, for example, Fitzroy, where you have organically emerging graffiti and street art is very pervasive. And I'm just wondering, has the center been the main focus of this project? And if so, is that a conscious decision in order not to interfere with the environments where these expressions emerge organically already?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So if I expand out from that map, you will see, as Peter indicates, the central business district of Melbourne is very tightly enclosed by this grid, and beyond that, things become a little bit more kind of organic. So this project is focused entirely on that central business district for the reason that this has been the part of the city most hit by the pandemic. It's full of high-rise office buildings that are now empty, and all of the businesses around there that have been dependent on these workers are now empty. So the main reason to come to the city to go to work is now absent. And the whole mythology of not just of Melbourne, for other cities worldwide, as the central city, as the kind of workhorse for the economy, has been really disrupted. And we have a return to some of those earlier moments in Melbourne's history where the city is very empty. So within the city grid, there's 200 laneways. And we are working in 40 of those.
Excellent. Thank you, Lachlan. I see that Malcolm has a question as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lachlan, for a very interesting presentation, and good to see you, even if it's long away. So I wonder if you can develop some of how Benjamin was useful to you, and about since his method is, as you say, very special. So how could you use that?
Yeah, so Benjamin's ideas obviously are very, familiar to everyone who's done an undergrad arts degree probably, but also very idiosyncratic, a weird mix of kind of Marxism and mysticism. But I think in the Arcades project, it was that attention to history and the kind of very particular ideas about modernity and the history of the city, the capacity to think about some things that are usually repressed in ordinary history. So Benjamin has a section in the Arcades project on prostitution, has sections about different types of commodities, has sections about street signage and the alphabet, some of which really resonate with graffiti and street art. So when I was walking into the laneways, and again, I say this to my group of colleagues here, like such a weird experience to basically be led around an empty city by a group of city bureaucrats and being asked, we stop at each street and they would say to me, do you want this one? And I would say, yes. They would make a little note and we would move on. So with a virtually unlimited budget, with a huge staffing, this is the complete upside down kind of nature of the post-COVID kind of art space in Melbourne, where we have now enormous resources to do things, but actually mostly our artists are used to working on very modest scale. And I myself am not so interested in the monumental kind of corporate street art. So we are trying to use a huge budget to do very modest things. So Benjamin, I think, to answer your question, Malcolm, Benjamin keeps us grounded in the little things and the little details, and stops us becoming fascists, becoming kind of monumental, majestic, overblown, and staying very kind of material in our thinking, and looking for coincidences and very small gestures. You know, I think about my work, you know, when I'm doing graffiti or street art. So I go into these laneways like a graffiti writer or a street artist. I'm looking at the walls thinking, yeah, that's a good wall. I'm going to take that wall. I'm going to tag here. I'm going to climb there. So I'm trying to curate a project that is not in the vein of many global street art projects, which tend to large figurative, you know, corporate walls that are, yeah, not so interesting.
Thank you very much, Lachlan. That wraps up this panel, this first panel. I will hand the word over to Pedro again. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I have here a technical programmatic thing going on here. So we are on 11:30. Actually, I do not see Carlos Mare around. I don't know if he's disguised by someone's name or Zoom somewhere. Carlos, if you are there, please show up. I think he's not. So I think sometimes things go right in wrong lines. So we have here achieved the regulation of the program because
we're back on schedule.
Yeah, we are back on schedule actually. So I hope that Carlos will, he asked me to be on this panel also because he was part of the EPOP Education Center in New York University, and he wanted to have a conversation also about this kind of, these academic studies and methodologies and these kind of approaches. But anyway, he will be around hopefully in the last day. So hopefully we will see him. So we are getting back to the schedule. I already have here the note from the first speaker on the second panel, Clara Sarmiento. She needs to, she will present the project Street Art she actually needs to take the vaccine right after the presentation. So I will give you like 10 minutes short break and we will come back with Clara. Yes? Okay. So it's just a fast short break and we are back here at 11:45. Okay. And for Clara presentation. Can it be, Clara? Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay.
Perfect.
So,
thank you so much.
Welcome. So 10 minutes and we are back. Okay. Thank you.
Right.
Talk soon.